We are joined now by Brian Stelter, special correspondent for Vanity Fair, and also the author of a very provocative and interesting new op-ed for Vox. We can put this up on the screen. That had again, a very provocative headline. It was just, did the media botch the Biden age story? We're going to get into all of that with Brian in just a moment. But Brian, first of all, thanks for joining the show.
Yeah, great to be here. Thanks.
Yeah, so I just want to start off with a question that I will preface by saying is being asked in total good faith and is maybe a little adversarial. But, you write in this, the national media wasn't dodging the story. You say there's this third option that the story should have been tougher, the volume should have been louder. You say, I was part of the problem. I appeared on MSNBC and said that Biden's age could decide the election, quote, if the media obsesses over it and ignores Trump's faults. Back in the early Trump administration, there was this conversation raging about the 25th Amendment and the anonymous New York Times op-ed. And you platformed that conversation, gave it a decent bit of oxygen on your show, asked if Trump was well and all of that. So my question based on this is, the story should have been tougher, the volume should have been louder, the quote from the Vox op-ed. Why wasn't it? Why was the volume on the Trump stories much louder than the volume was on the Biden story, just given the obvious sort of mental diminishment that we'd been seeing from Joe Biden?
I think this has a lot to do with who the actors are in any given story or scenario. And right now in the Biden story, the main actors are not journalists. They are Democratic lawmakers, Democratic activists, Democratic partisan commentators, but people who are clearly on the Democratic side who are making this a major story. There's a crisis around Biden, not because of the media per se, but because of people in his own party who want him out. I would say there were elements of that as well in the Trump years. There were Republicans, there were anonymous Trump officials, aides, all raising questions about Trump's fitness. So I don't think the media was driving either of those narratives, but obviously because all of this it's all mediated through the media, it's all covered by television networks and streamers and columnists, it always looks like a media creation when it's not. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
It's not a full answer, but I think that's part of the background here. But then to your broader point about the coverage of Biden, I say it wasn't ignored because the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Washington Post were doing really strong stories about how he was getting older, he was getting slower, aides were noticing he was slipping. However, it feels to me like those dots weren't always connected. Like they were treated as, and honestly, that was my mistake. That was my mistake. And I'm just a freelancer now who just watches TV and chats with people like you. But what I made the mistake of thinking these were all isolated episodes and not connecting the dots. I think a lot of people, myself included, gave the benefit of the doubt to the White House when maybe we shouldn't have.
And I guess it's a sign of what we kind of already knew, take the New York Times, for instance. And I'm curious for your take as a watcher and somebody who's covered the New York Times for decades now. They have, like, a switch has flipped. Like, it seems like inside the New York Times, they're like, we're getting this guy out. And it seems like all hands on deck. The news side is, calling donors and calling politicians and writing and elevating comments from Democrats who are calling for him to step aside. And the opinion side, both the editorializing directly from the New York Times, the unnamed editorial board, whatever that is very, very strong. And then also the columns that they're elevating, like James Carville. At the same time, James Carville calling for him to drop out and have an open convention. That's all newsworthy. You've had some kind of blue MAGA Democrats who've said, well, why won't the New York Times call for Trump to drop out? And it's like, well, because it just kind of elevates something we all understand, that nobody on the Republican side would care if the New York Times does that. But on the Democratic side, they do. It kind of solidifies our understanding that it's part of it's become really part of the Democratic ecosystem, hasn't it, in a way that maybe it wasn't 10, 20 years ago. Like, if the New York Times would have called on a Republican to drop out 20 years ago, that would have actually mattered in a way that I think it wouldn't matter today. Is that right?
I mean, look, I worked at the New York Times from 2007 to 2013. I always knew back then, and I still know today, that the newsroom is so separate from the editorial pages. They work on different floors in the building. There is no coordination. All of that is true. So 20 years ago, if the editorial pages had called for Republican to step down, I don't think it would have registered that much, to be honest. It depends on the race, depends on the context. Also, we lived in a completely different political environment. I mean, completely different. We were not ruled by an American gerontocracy, these elderly men that run the government that most people are tired of. I mean, that's one of the themes, I think, of your program that I really appreciate. People of all ages, but especially people under 65, are desperate for younger leadership. And that's, to me, the bigger story of Biden's age right now. It's not really about Biden. Well, it is about Biden, obviously, whether he's fit for office. But it's much bigger than Biden. This is about Trump and the Supreme Court and elderly members of Congress that won't give up their posts. This is a big story. And so when you say the New York Times seems to be flipped a switch, I understand why it feels that way about Biden, but I don't think that's actually how it works inside the New York Times newsroom. I think the way it works is they see there's a big story developing. People that were in denial about Biden's age are no longer in denial. The Democratic Party, many leaders want him out. This is an emergency. And a lot of people are pretending like it's not in public, but they're saying it's an emergency in private. So I view the New York Times as just trying to cover a massive story in front of itself, in front of its eyes.
One of the things you wrote about in the Vox op-ed is that people in the White House press corps, for example, were recalling stories of being harassed and harangued by the Biden White House, the Biden campaign, for reporting of Peter Baker, Ezra Klein. And I'm sure, Brian, you've encountered some of this just over the course of the last couple of weeks, just in having some of these conversations openly. Does that mean that the media in some way was overly responsive? Because they were still publishing stories, I think that's true, but were they sort of responding to that bullying by being bullied by the White House? What's your sense of how they responded to that?
I think it's complex. I think it varies. I do think there are probably some occasions where the White House was able to water down stories dramatically. They were able to dilute stories by, for example, providing half a dozen aides on the phone, on the record, all to attest to Biden's fitness. I mean, this is typical journalism 101 and PR 101. If you're up against a journalist writing a tough story, you might try to change the narrative or weaken the narrative by providing, well, shall we say, counterpoints, right? And so the Biden administration was providing counterpoints. They were putting administration officials on the record to say he's sharp as a tack, he's stronger than all of us, to the point where it became kind of a joke among the reporters, this idea that all the Biden aides, all the younger aides insist that Biden is faster and better than them. People see through this to some degree, especially now. But I do think that the bullying or the really aggressive press efforts, we'd be ridiculous not to think it had some impact. And by the way, there's a connection there to the Trump years, right? How did the Trump administration begin? By lying about crowd size. It created antagonism between the press corps and the president right away, right on the very first weekend. The Biden relationship with the press has been different. He's kept the press at a distance, but has been more outwardly respectful. And do I think that makes a difference in how he's been treated or covered? Yes, probably, right? I don't want to pretend otherwise, right, Emily?
Yeah.
And there's also been a relationship between the White House, some kind of blue MAGA, you could call them blue MAGA White House influencers, and then a kind of blue MAGA base that is out there on social media that is going after.
We have to call it blue MAGA.
What should we call it?
Is it Blue Anon? Is that what it is?
Blue Anon?
Yeah, that's what people call it.
That's even worse. Blue Anon's even worse. But it is wild out there, Ryan.
It is, right? I mean, you've been probably on the receiving end. You as a public figure, you're of course, like it's nothing new to get criticism, et cetera. But what's it been like? How has it been different? Or has it been different?
It has been different.
Yes, and describe the difference, because I've noticed it too.
So number one, let's go back to the night of the debate. Let's go back a little bit further. Remember the State of the Union address? Mm-hmm. Remember how charged and energetic and defiant Biden was that night? He outperformed almost every expectation. My personal theory is that he read his own reviews and he became maybe even too confident in his abilities going forward because he had a breakthrough night. And for a lot of people who might have been worried about his age or his health, or they might have relaxed a little bit. Thankfully, reporters of the Wall Street Journal didn't. They found some great information and published it in early June. But my point is, there were moments earlier this year that might have lulled people into a sense of complacency when it comes to Biden's ability to do the job and to campaign, more importantly, to campaign for president. Then the debate happens. And I was on a Canadian television network right afterward. And I said, this is an emergency. I didn't use the word emergency, but I said, there are many Democrats who now want to replace him. This is an unprecedented moment. And the anchor literally says to me, Brian, I've watched you for years. I've never heard you talk this way. And I came off the air and I wondered, was I too strong? Like, did I go too far? Is this really that bad for Biden? But then I go watch CNN and MSNBC and Fox, and everybody, there was a consensus immediately. And we should not pretend otherwise. Like, this was a very clear, this was a nonpartisan conclusion, right? That there was something really troubling about Biden's behavior on stage. So with that in mind, the response from pro-Biden social media followers just seems as if it comes from a different planet. It just seems as if it's happening from Earth 2. And as you know, I've talked a lot about Earth 2 in relation to Trump fans. Nobody who's ever heard of, look, if you know one thing about my career at CNN, it was that I was very tough and critical of the President Trump and the pro-Trump media. That's basically my brand. I think it's more complicated, but if you had to summarize me in a sentence, you'd say, yeah, Stelter, the guy that was always calling out Trump. And so to have all of these deep blue liberal social media fans pretending as if I am some MAGA diehard, some Trump actor, it has been a weird time, Ryan. I mean, you've seen it online too. It's a weird moment. And so I think we should go a little deeper. What's causing that behavior? Like, where's that coming from, right? I think it's coming out of fear. I think it's mostly out of fear that Trump is going to return, that Biden's going to lose and Trump's going to return. And so you have a lot of these Biden diehards who are desperate to shut down the conversation about their candidate.
And do you, looking back, feel like maybe that fear ever influenced the way that you covered the Trump administration? Because I'm fascinated by this question of the benefit of the doubt that you mentioned, that like maybe that was giving the benefit of the doubt to the Biden administration when they talked about his health. He had some good moments. He looked okay. But then, for example, your response to the Hunter Biden laptop story, this is a classic example of the right-wing media machine. That's a quote from maybe 2020. There's still a lot we don't know about the president's ties with Russia, period. And we could get into all of this. We don't need to get into all of this, but I genuinely am interested in that question, the benefit of the doubt, because I do feel like that's the rub between a lot of media critics like myself and people in the media. And I know you even in the Vox op-ed sort of take issue in an interesting way with what we describe as the media, what we define as the media, because we're all in our bubbles right now.
Yeah.
But personally, like as you think about it, why do you think it is that you gave the benefit of the doubt there, but not to, and maybe to the Biden campaign with the Hunter Biden laptop story too, and took that claim of disinformation very seriously?
Well, I think number one, the State of the Union is an example of why some people were inclined to give Biden the benefit of the doubt. That on the moments where there was a lot of scrutiny about how he was going to perform, was he up for the task, he then outperformed. And I think there is a narrative now in the right-wing media that says, haha, we told you so, we told you Biden was senile, that conveniently forgets all the moments where he did outperform, all the moments where he was energetic, where he did, stick it to the Republicans, achieve bipartisanship, et cetera. But I do think the benefit of the doubt thing is real. It's just a theory of mine. I hope maybe others disagree. I want to hear it. I would also differentiate between individual members of the media and the media writ large as a blob, right? Because big newsrooms exist in order to make sure a benefit of the doubt doesn't happen, make sure that neutrality and independence is achieved, to make sure that there isn't bias in the coverage. I know you think they often come up short, and maybe they do, but newsrooms are structured in order to push all of that stuff out and ensure that people in power are being held accountable. I just think on a more personal, individual level, when you think about certain columnists and commentators and talking heads, Biden he's been respected. And to some extent, every president should be respected. I feel like I respected President Trump in certain points. For example, when he had COVID, and there was a real concern about the American president's health. Right. Well, that's where we are again now. Real, deep, profound concern about the American president's health. And these Biden diehards who think the media is out to get him, they're totally missing what's actually happening, which is that journalists are trying to scratch as hard as we can to figure out what's really going on in this White House, which increasingly, there's increasing questions about whether there was a cover-up. And we say that not to say officially there was a cover-up, but it's a question that has to be asked. It's a question that has to be addressed.
And is there much? So the reporters that you spoke with doing the reporting here, what is the reflection? What do they think they could have done differently so that this wouldn't have happened? Or do they think that this was just structurally, they were just bound, this was just overdetermined?
What do you mean overdetermined? What do you mean?
Like that the media is what it is, and if the White House is going to kind of cover up the situation and snow them with a bunch of on-the-record people saying that, you know, Joe Biden can outrun every 20-year-old intern in the White House. Well, they don't have interns anymore for reasons that we know. They renamed them. You know, that facing those structures of like and you know, the Wall Street Journal article is an excellent example. Like after that story came out, you had the entire Democratic apparatus pushing back on them, saying this was flawed and faulty reporting. You had a bunch of Democratic electeds who came out and said, I gave them an on-the-record quote, and we didn't, and they didn't use it. Yeah. This is outrageous. Patty Murray, who now wants him to drop out. Yeah. It's outrageous that they didn't use these on-the-record quotes. And then you'd have all the Rachel Vindmans of the world regurgitating that, saying that this is flawed journalism. How on earth could they not quote on the record? It's clear that they're biased. And the reporters are like, because they were lying, and also we included extensive quotes from the White House, you know, making their case. But we don't have room for every lying Democrat who's going to go on the record and say that, yeah, he can outrun me. So given those structural problems that individual reporters face, do they feel like they screwed up and they could have done this differently and they regret it? Or do they feel like they're just up against a force that they can't overcome?
Well, I think there's a lot of points of view. I'm really interested in the point of view that several reporters shared with me, that the coverage should have become more aggressive when Biden decided to run for re-election. Because all of a sudden it wasn't about his performance for one more year, it was about 5 more years. And I think that there's a lot of merit to that argument. And then again, you know, look at the Wall Street Journal story in June. That is an example of more aggressive coverage once he was running for re-election. I also think we're talking about a story that's inherently complex and uncomfortable. It's about someone getting older. Many of us have experienced this with a parent or a grandparent. We all have lived experience here, which does, you know, it's a relevant part of the story, right? People don't want to live in a gerontocracy. And I think that came through in the news coverage in the last couple of years. The polls have been clear all along that Americans believed Biden was too old to serve for another 4 years, and Trump as well, for that matter. Americans don't want these two choices, right? I think that has come through in the coverage. We've heard about double haters. But I think here's the challenge with covering aging. It's not an immediate flood. And news outlets are really good at covering floods. Like, I helped cover floods for CNN. You know, it's an emergency. It's happening immediately. You can see it happening in real time. It's a lot harder to cover a drip, 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 drip. And isn't this a drip, drip story where Biden is, you know, gradually declining? That's at least what it appears from you know, many people's eyes. I went and saw him in Philadelphia 2 summers ago, that democracy speech. People now remember it as the one with the blood red background that looked really eerie. But it was this fantastic speech at Independence Hall. He's a very different person than he was 2 years ago when he delivered that speech. And but it's been drip, drip, drip. And I think drip, drip, drip is it's inherently harder for journalists to cover. I say that not to let them off the hook, but just to recognize this is a tough story. It's a lot harder than pointing out when President Trump was lying on Twitter, which, as you know, Emily, I loved to do that. Well, or calling out his typos. It's really easy to call out the typos.
Yeah, there were many of them, and there continue to be many of them. The cheap fake sort of trend is one thing I also want to ask about, because there is genuinely an interesting question here. You tweeted a Washington Post article about it was like cheap fake video. Biden videos enrapture right-wing media, but deeply mislead. That's the Post headline, and I think this is a Glenn Kessler. It's a Glenn Kessler, Adriano Usero analysis of the videos from the G7 summit, and there was some deceptive editing of those. But what's interesting is it gets back into this sort of subjective question of so many people in the media really did take that cheap fake line almost straight from the White House, was the White House response, and use it to kind of define that line of attack from the right as almost entirely one of cheap fakes. It was all, bad faith. rather than there was something real there, which you have since said you think there are real problems in these videos. So do you think the media was overly credulous, was overly willing, again, to give the benefit of the doubt to the White House with the cheap fake line, instead of, like, for me, the main story there as a journalist is that Joe Biden often looks like he's zoning out and that he's having trouble. There are people at the G7 telling media outlets, the New York Post had a story about this, that he didn't seem well. That's the headline story for me. Not that the RNC is doing partisan hackery and putting out, potentially cheap fake videos. That's a totally secondary story to me, but the media elevated it to be ahead of the story at the time about Biden's health itself.
Well, yes, except I think it depends on who and what we mean by media, right? As always, I think if you were listening to Fox's coverage of Biden in recent months, you might feel better informed right now than if you were reading liberal blogs, and that's a problem, right? At the same time, I think some of the videos Fox was showing were misleading. Not all of them. Some of them. And so it's complicated. Some were cheap fakes and some were legitimate. And they were all, and yes, it is true. The White House, I think, tried to claim all of them were BS, right? I was texting with the White House aide at the time. I was hearing that storyline, that this is BS. When I think Glenn Kessler does a fact check, he's doing something narrow, but it does then create this broader perception that you should just ignore. I mean, what you're hitting at is really interesting. It's like, the implication then is just don't pay attention to this because it's all just noise.
Right.
And that attitude benefited Biden for a while, right?
Right, and why not fact check the White House when they say this other video is just a cheap fake when it's not a cheap fake? Why not do a fact check of that instead of the fact check of the RNC? The focus to me just seemed to be more of that kind of benefit of the doubt before the debate, and then the debate threw that all out the window.
I think it depends on the constituency as well, though. I now see a whole lot of progressives who want the media to be Democratic activists, who are demanding that the media perform the role of Democratic lawmakers. And I think there's oftentimes this mix-up about what the role of the journalist should be versus an activist, versus a partisan commentator, versus a lawmaker. Like, the media is not coming to the rescue, right? Not against Biden and not against Trump. And I think there's a lot of distortion of that happening right now among desperate Democrats who are freaking out about Trump probably winning.
Although some people would argue the media is intentionally coming to the rescue now that they've seen the polling numbers.
I know. But doesn't that imply conspiracy? Like, doesn't that? Yeah.
Or it's, that we played for your former colleague Don Lemon when he was on the show, this clip of Noam Chomsky, actually. It was a brilliant clip.
I remember this. Yeah.
He's asking a journalist, and he's saying, essentially, they don't need to, there doesn't have to be a conspiracy. It's more just that you're from the same sort of social places, socioeconomic status, and you sort of run in the same circles and share a lot of the worldview. So there doesn't have to be a conspiracy so much as, it's just, most people live in Manhattan, D.C., and think alike, live similar lives, and come out on these things with a similar perspective.
I understand that critique. I think it's important to unpack that critique. It's also, what's the phrase? There's some phrase in political science for this, or like it's self-sealing, or you can't. How do you unprove? How do you disprove it, right? Because if I try to talk against that talking point, then I sound like I must just I don't see it in front of myself here. I mean, here's what I know about myself, right? I was a kid from a lower middle class background in Maryland who went to a state school, joined the New York Times, got to CNN. Like, probably not a typical path into CNN, but it is true that once you're inside a giant national news organization, you are aware that that lots of people are watching, that there's a certain vibe that comes from the news coverage. Certain stories are considered breaking news. That's true, but I don't think that within that reality, though, I think you do have incredible diversity at these news organizations, and that's how it should be. And you need that diversity. But I don't know. I'm not as smart as Noam. None of us are.
Now I'm curious. That was my path too. Though we were kind of looking up maybe at lower middle
from Maryland,
but also Maryland. Where and also state school in Maryland. Where in Maryland? Just curious.
I grew up in Damascus in northern Montgomery County, and then I went to Towson University. And
cool.
What I appreciate about the story that we all tell a story about ourselves, right? What our own narrative is. what I like about my narrative, if I have one, is that I went through side doors. I didn't go through the front door, right? I didn't submit a resume. I was able to get to the New York Times through a blog, by blogging, and I got to CNN through my work at the Times. And so I like that those paths exist in a way they didn't exist 30 years ago before the internet, because I think it does bring in different kinds of people into newsrooms, and that can be hopefully advantageous to the media coverage.
Well, cool. I mean, it's been good to talk with you. You got anything else, Emily?
Just appreciate the conversation. Yeah. Thanks, Brian.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks, guys.
Hey, if you liked that video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Breaking Points.
If you want to see the rest of Counterpoints, go to breakingpoints.com to become a premium member and get the full uncut show every morning in your inbox and on Spotify.